Samantha. I am 28 years old, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had seen it all as a nanny. I had worked with kids who threw tantrums in the middle of Walmart, toddlers who smeared peanut butter into carpet like it was an art form, and teens who thought blasting music at midnight was a human right. I had soothed teething babies at 3 a.m., cleaned up after stomach bugs that spread like wildfire, and navigated complicated family dynamics like a UN peacekeeper. But nothing, not the worst diaper explosion or the most unreasonable parent review, could have prepared me for the day I got accused of destroying a family's entire entertainment system and almost lost my freedom over it. I had been nannying professionally for 6 years, traveling between jobs in different cities, always looking for short-term or temporary gigs that allowed me flexibility. I had 5-star reviews across every platform you can imagine: Care.com, Urban Sitter, even private agency placements. I took pride in my work, in the calm I brought to chaos, the structure I gave to wild, untamed routines. Parents trusted me, kids loved me, and I always made sure to go above and beyond. Whether that meant teaching the alphabet to a 4-year-old in a week or organizing the toy room on my own time. That is why I said yes, without hesitation, when a family from suburban Raleigh, North Carolina, reached out to me for what they called a high-priority one-day job. They offered 5 times my normal rate just for one Saturday. The catch? I had to drive in from out of town, arrive at 9 a.m., and stay until after midnight. The parents explained they had an event they could not reschedule and needed someone reliable for their 6- and 8-year-old kids. I was flattered they had even found me, much less offered such a ridiculous sum for just one day. Of course I agreed. It was too good to pass up. Everything seemed normal at first. The kids were high energy, sure, but sweet. The house was a gorgeous 2-story in a quiet cul-de-sac, tastefully decorated with signs that said things like "Live, Laugh, Love" and "Grateful, Thankful, Blessed." There were picture frames of family vacations to the Grand Canyon and Disney World. I remember noting the giant flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace, with a sleek, black game console resting on a low glass table below. The kids were excited to play on it, and I promised they could have screen time later, but first I would cook us all lunch. That decision, walking away into the kitchen, still haunts me. I had just started boiling water for pasta when I heard the crash, not a little thud or a dropped toy. This was a full-on shatter. My heart dropped into my stomach. I ran back into the living room and froze. The TV was face down on the hardwood floor, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. The console was next to it, cables ripped out, its plastic casing split. And beside the wreckage stood the 2 kids, looking pale and motionless, their hands still in the air, like they had just realized gravity was a law and not a suggestion. I did not even know what to say. My hands were shaking as I lifted the television slightly, hoping against all logic that maybe, somehow, it was not as bad as it looked. It was. The weight of what this would cost hit me like a freight train. I dropped to my knees and began picking up shards of glass with a towel. I knew I had to clean it up. The last thing I wanted was one of them stepping on a sharp piece and turning this into a medical emergency on top of everything else. The parents were due back around 7 p.m. I kept it together, distracting the kids with board games and trying to act like everything was okay while my brain spiraled. with anxiety. When the front door opened and I heard their voices, I felt like I was about to be sick. The dad stepped into the living room first and stopped in his tracks. His wife followed. Her eyes widened as she looked from the cleanup mess to the empty space where the TV used to be. I opened my mouth to explain, to walk them through the timeline, to show them I had done everything I could to clean up and keep the kids safe. But they cut me off. They turned to their children and asked what had happened, and without missing a beat, the little girl said that I got very angry and threw the TV on the floor. Her brother nodded and added that I had shouted at them and told them they could not play anymore. I could not breathe. I said that was not true. I begged them to listen, but their faces turned crimson with fury. The dad's voice rose, his words cutting and sharp, saying I was a danger, irresponsible, unhinged even. The mom was on the verge of tears, saying that I had traumatized her kids and destroyed expensive property. Then came the demand. Not only was I to repay the full cost of the television and console, I was to pay 3 times its value, because according to them, I had emotionally scarred their children. I refused. I told them this was absurd, that I did not have thousands of dollars to hand over, and that I did not even do what they were accusing me of. The kids had knocked it over. That was the truth, and deep down, they had to know it. But they did not care. When I turned to grab my bag and leave, they blocked the door. The dad physically stepped in front of it, arms crossed, telling me I was not going anywhere until they had the money in hand. The mom sat on the couch and picked up her phone. I panicked, thinking she was calling the police. A strange silence filled the room, broken only by the kids asking if they could go play in their room. I stood there frozen, my heart beating in my ears. I asked how they expected me to just magically come up with money I did not have. He said that was not their problem. I should call someone, borrow, beg, but I would not leave until they were satisfied. I had never in my life felt so powerless. I stood there clutching my bag, my phone in my hand, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. The walls felt like they were closing in. I was in a stranger's house, outnumbered, out of town, and no one would believe me over 2 crying children and 2 furious parents. I kept thinking of how fast 5-star reviews could vanish, how a single accusation could ruin 6 years of hard work. I had no proof, no camera footage, no witness, nothing, just my word against theirs. And in that moment, I did not know what to do. I was scared, not just for my career, but for myself. Because when you are trapped in someone else's home, and they are angry enough to lie, and you are the outsider with no power, the line between accusation and entrapment begins to blur, and I stood right on it, terrified and alone. Update 1. Samantha. I am 28 years old, and standing in that living room in Raleigh, North Carolina, with my back practically pressed against the wall and the front door blocked by an angry man twice my size, I realized something terrifyingly simple. Being honest had gotten me nowhere. My calm explanations, my professional record, my years of spotless work meant nothing in that moment. I was no longer a trusted nanny. I was a convenient villain. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to curl my fingers into my palm to stop them from trembling. My phone felt heavy, like it weighed 10 pounds instead of a few ounces. I could feel their eyes on me, watching every movement, every breath, like predators waiting for weakness. I knew if I openly said I was calling the police, the situation could escalate in ways I did not want to imagine. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I lied. I told them I would call a friend, someone who might be able to help me get the money. I said it calmly, slowly, trying to sound defeated enough to satisfy them, but not broken enough to invite more cruelty. The father stepped away from the door just slightly, enough to make it look like he was being reasonable, while still making it very clear I was not free to leave. The mother watched me closely, arms crossed, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. I walked a few steps toward the hallway, pretending I needed privacy for the call. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any second, but I forced myself to move normally. Inside, my mind was racing. I knew this was no longer about a broken television or a set-top box. This was about unlawful restraint. They were keeping me there against my will, and that crossed a line I could not ignore. As soon as I was out of their direct line of sight, I unlocked my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a second, fear crashing into logic. I had one chance to do this right. I could not stutter. I could not hesitate. I opened the dial pad and typed 3 numbers that suddenly felt like the most important decision of my life. While the call connected, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I spoke quietly, carefully, explaining where I was, what had happened, how I was being prevented from leaving the house. I made sure to emphasize that there were children present and that the situation was escalating every second, felt like a minute. Every sound from the living room made my stomach twist, terrified they would realize what I was doing. When I ended the call, I slid my phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath. There was nothing else I could do now except wait and pretend. I returned to the living room, putting on my best imitation of someone making desperate arrangements. I nodded when they looked at me, kept my voice low, acted like I was cooperating. Inside, I was counting time, listening for sirens, praying I had not made a mistake. The atmosphere in the house was thick and suffocating. The children were sent to their rooms, confused and quiet now, the excitement of earlier replaced by tension they did not understand. The parents paced, muttering, throwing angry glances my way. I stood there, feeling smaller by the second, reminding myself over and over that help was coming. When the knock finally came at the door, it was sharp and authoritative. The shift was immediate. The father froze, the mother's face drained of color. When the door opened and uniformed officers stepped inside, the entire narrative they had built collapsed in an instant. Their shock was almost physical. They tried to explain, to redirect blame, to paint me as unstable and dangerous, but the officers were not there to argue with emotions. They were there for facts. The moment the officers realized I had been blocked from leaving, the mood changed completely. The handcuffs came out quickly, efficiently, and suddenly the people who had towered over me minutes earlier were the ones being restrained. The screaming started then, accusations flying in every direction, fingers pointed at me as if I had orchestrated the entire situation. I stood there, stunned, my legs barely holding me up, watching control shift back where it belonged. We were all escorted out of the house and into separate vehicles, neighbors peeking through curtains as flashing lights painted the quiet street red and blue. The ride to the police station felt unreal, like I was watching my life through someone else's eyes. My hands were still shaking, but now it was from adrenaline instead of fear. As the doors of the station closed behind us, and the officers began the process of figuring out what really happened, one thought echoed in my mind louder than anything else. If I had not made that call, if I had tried to be polite, patient, or understanding for even a few minutes longer, I do not know how this night would have ended. Update 2. Samantha. I am 28 years old, and I had never been inside a police station for anything more than a fingerprint clearance when applying for jobs. But that night, I found myself sitting in a cold, fluorescent-lit interview room while officers tried to untangle a story that had spiraled far beyond a broken TV and a few frightened kids. I sat in a stiff metal chair, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm water, my nerves still raw from the emotional whiplash of everything that had happened in the last few hours. I kept replaying the moment the handcuffs clicked onto the wrists of the parents who had just tried to hold me hostage. And yet, even with them finally out of their home turf advantage, I knew this mess was far from over. After being separated, questioned, and documented, the three of us ended up in the same holding area of sorts, though far enough apart that the tension didn't erupt into shouting. The officers were calm but visibly frustrated. The facts were murky. The parents insisted that I had thrown a tantrum, broken the TV in a rage, and terrified their children. I insisted that the kids had accidentally knocked it over while I was cooking, and that I was then trapped in their home when I refused to pay for something I did not do. The most maddening part was that the only third-party witnesses were the children, 6 and 8 years old. Their stories were inconsistent in little ways. First they said I yelled, then they said I was quiet. First they said I pushed the TV, then they said I picked it up. But at the end of the day, they were kids, and they were scared, and they were parroting whatever script they thought would please their parents or keep themselves out of trouble. The officers knew it, too. They asked thoughtful questions. They looked for discrepancies. But at the end of the night, no one had anything concrete. No security cameras, no video evidence, just conflicting testimonies and a ruined piece of electronics. That is when the exhaustion turned into frustration. I was not about to let my reputation, my record, my future be decided by ambiguity. I took a deep breath and told the officers that if nothing could be resolved tonight, I would prefer to settle this properly in court. I said I would file an official claim and let a judge review the circumstances. I said I would rather trust the system than walk away with a smear on my name and a trauma that would haunt me every time I entered another stranger's house. The moment the words left my mouth, the energy in the room shifted. The parents, who had up to that point carried themselves with loud confidence and exaggerated victimhood, fell silent. The mother's face paled. The father stopped, pacing. It was subtle, but I saw it, the flicker of fear in their expressions, because now this was no longer about controlling the narrative in their living room. It was about evidence, credibility, and consequences. And they had none of the former and far too much of the latter. They began to push back. They said court was unnecessary, that this was a misunderstanding, that things had gotten out of hand. They said it was not worth escalating, but I did not budge. I leaned in and calmly stated that I had nothing to hide, and that this situation deserved to be seen through legally and fairly. One of the officers nodded and agreed that this was a viable path forward. They made a note that both parties could be scheduled to appear in small claims court within the next week, and that until then, there would be no further contact between us. Restraining boundaries were set. I would receive the full report in writing. The parents looked cornered. Their previous bravado had dissolved into quiet panic. They were starting to realize that bluffing your way through rage and intimidation works in your own home, but not in front of sworn officers and legal forms. The father muttered something about the cost of hiring a lawyer. The mother looked like she was on the verge of tears. I just stood there, feeling, finally, like the power imbalance had been corrected. As I stepped outside the police station into the still, humid Raleigh night, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. The street was quiet, but my heart was racing with a different kind of energy now. I knew that in court, where emotion would not overpower logic, where they would have to answer for keeping me in their home against my will, where they would have to explain why their children's stories shifted with each retelling, I would win. They knew it too. That is why they had tried so hard to keep things contained in the living room, because they were never interested in truth. They were interested in leverage, and they had just lost it. That realization hit me with more force than anything else that night. For the first time since the crash of that television, I felt in control again. And that is exactly why they were scared. Update 3. Samantha. I am 28 years old, and the week between that night at the police station and the court date felt longer than the 6 years I had spent building my career. I barely slept. Every sound startled me awake. Every notification on my phone made my chest tighten. But fear slowly gave way to focus. I knew I needed help. Real help. Not just optimism and good intentions. So I hired a lawyer. He was not flashy or dramatic. He was calm, methodical, and relentless in the quietest way possible. He specialized in civil cases that involved false accusations and unlawful restraint. And from the first meeting, he took my situation seriously. He did not interrupt me. He let me tell the entire story from start to finish. Every detail from the moment I accepted the job in Raleigh to the second the police escorted us into separate rooms. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, nodded once, and told me something that stuck with me. People who rely on intimidation rarely prepare for scrutiny. Over the next few days, he worked fast. He requested the police reports, obtained copies of my work history, my reviews, my contracts, and even statements from families I had worked with in Charlotte, Durham, and Asheville. Parents who barely knew me wrote pages about how trustworthy I was, how their children adored me, how they had never once questioned my professionalism. Meanwhile, my lawyer requested background checks on the parents. That was when the story began to crack open. What came out in court was not just ugly. It was calculated. The parents had a history of disputes with short-term caregivers, complaints that never escalated far enough to leave public records, but patterns nonetheless. A broken lamp here, a damaged tablet there, always blamed on the nanny, always followed by demands for money, threats of legal action, or pressure to settle quietly. What they had not counted on was someone refusing to be intimidated. The most disturbing part came from the investigation into the children's statements. A court-appointed child psychologist interviewed them separately, away from their parents, in a neutral environment, without pressure, without fear of punishment. The truth came out in fragments at first, then in a flood. The children admitted that their parents had told them to knock over the TV. They were instructed on what to say afterward. They were promised rewards if they obeyed and consequences if they did not. To the kids, it was a game. To the parents, it was a system. The courtroom went silent when that report was read. The judge's expression hardened in a way I will never forget. This was no longer about a broken television or a nanny dispute. This was about exploitation, about using children as tools to manipulate and extort caregivers who were isolated, out of town, and unlikely to fight back. My lawyer presented everything cleanly, calmly, without theatrics. He showed how I had been prevented from leaving the house, how the demand for triple compensation had no legal basis, how my actions after the incident had been focused on safety and de-escalation, how their actions had been focused on control. The parents tried to defend themselves, tried to soften the story, tried to frame it as discipline gone wrong or a misunderstanding, but the evidence did not bend to their panic. When the ruling came, it felt unreal. I won completely. The court dismissed every accusation against me. The parents were found liable for false imprisonment and fraud. But the most devastating outcome for them had nothing to do with money. Child Protective Services had been observing the case closely. And once the exploitation was proven, action was taken immediately. Temporary custody was revoked. The children were removed from the home, pending further evaluation, and placed with relatives while the case was reviewed. The parents cried, they begged, they asked for leniency, insisting they never thought it would go this far, but it already had. I sat there, listening to the verdict, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that my name was cleared, that my future was intact, that I had trusted my instincts when everything told me to stay quiet and comply. Sorrow for the children who had been taught that lying and destruction were ways to survive and please the people they depended on most. When I walked out of that courthouse in Raleigh, the sun felt different on my face, lighter, warmer. I had not just won a case. I had reclaimed my voice. I had proven that intimidation only works when silence follows. I still work as a nanny. I am more cautious now. I insist on contracts, on cameras, in shared spaces, on clear boundaries. But I did not let what happened break me or push me out of the profession I love. If anything, it sharpened me, because sometimes winning is not about money or pride. Sometimes winning is about refusing to disappear when someone tries to make you the villain in their story.